where will you find resilience? REdeploy.
Hi guys. So the title of my talk is very long, and I will address some of the things in the title, but as Jabe Paul just mentioned, I may have rewritten some of it based on what I heard yesterday. First of all, there's two things I'd like to say. One is I'm getting a PhD, and I always try to say this at the beginning of my talks. I do what's called action research, so I don't research people, I research with people. And as part of that, I need to prove that people are using the ideas that I research with them. So I'm super happy for you guys to take any of these ideas, use them however you want, but please reference me so that I can use you in my PhD as an example of my work. Second of all, I'm an outsider here. I don't do what you people do. I don't do what the resilience engineering community does necessarily. I research from a philosophical perspective, what do designers do? And I think it's interesting, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But a lot of this talk is just gonna be me trying to make sense of what I heard yesterday, kind of live with you. And I think that's interesting because I think one of the things about resilience engineering is the way in which those meeting of different frames or different mindsets or different ideas of how the world are, that is one of the more interesting parts of resilience engineering for me. So, if I had to do you, since I won't get through the whole slide deck, almost certainly, if I had to give you 3 slides about what this is about, it would be this. Sense-making is a sensual activity, making sense of sensual interactions. Things, in relation to other things, matter. And ontological design rhymes with resilience engineering. So I'm trying to take Dr. Cook's advice and not tell you how to think. So I like this rhyming idea. It's not that I am going to tell you a different way of seeing the world, but I want to see how they rhyme, how they fit together in weird patterns. So first I want to play with your heads a little bit. What color shoes am I wearing? What color is my shirt? Keep looking at me. There's a sign on the other side of the stage. What does it say? Sponsors. In what list? Okay, so one of the things I'm trying to point out really quickly is you are present. And that matters, that you are present. You don't have a representation of me in your head because I'm here and you don't need a representation to refer to what I am or what I'm doing. So my presence here is a way in which you can think. You are thinking with me. You are thinking with things, not about things. So let me do one more thing here. Hey, Paul. I took like 6 pages of notes yesterday on ideas I was having while listening to other speakers. Then I rewrote my whole talk. Are you nervous? I'm a little nervous. Maybe you should be nervous.
Okay, I will now reassess my...
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to kind of point out here is it strange that I'm not on stage? Am I not performing as a speaker right now? And isn't it strange that I had like a private conversation in the middle of a performance? And the other thing I wanted to kind of point out really quickly is if you were listening to this just as a recording, if you weren't present here, what I'm saying right now would even doubly not make sense because you wouldn't have this idea of me being on the stage or not being on the stage. You just hear a recording, right? So This like idea of being present to something or being present is important, and it has to do with the materiality of our interactions together. So who was here last year? How many of you saw Allspa speak? What color were his shoes? What color was his shirt? So there's this weird thing about not being present. Not being present is that we use representations. So we use a representational idea of someone else or something else to refer to. So now we're thinking about things, not with things. And what we can say really quickly about that is that when we're being present, the richness, the thickness of our experience is non-representational, but as we get further and further away from the presentness of this situation, our models tend to get lower fidelity with increasing generality. Yeah? So yesterday we talked about like having really quick 10-minute retrospectives very close to the event. Part of the reason to think about that is because of the way of the degrading of information. Does that make sense to everybody? I talk about sense making and I'd say, does that make sense? Which is a bad habit of mine, sorry. So everybody close your eyes real quickly. I want you to imagine that you are on a horse, you've got a big sharp stick, and there's a lizard that breathes fire in front of you. What do you do? Because everybody imagine what you would do next? Yeah? Okay, you can open your eyes. So the normal kind of way of explaining this, or one of the ways of explaining this, Alistair McIntyre talks about it. He says, one of the ways we decide what to do, when we want to know what to do, is we ask, what story are we in? And then for what actor am I in that story? And then what would that person do, right? So in a lot of ways, I hope you guys all kind of got that you were a knight, and the lizard was a dragon, and I could ask you guys all to draw different dragons. Everybody would have a slightly different one. There's a matching that doesn't really matter. It doesn't be exactly the right lizard, right? So this is representational narrative, allowing you to think about something, allowing you to think about a sequence of things. And so normally, that's as far as we go, because normally we're talking about representation and idea, especially when we're talking about the humanities. But I want to point out something really interesting, for me at least. And it has these three ideas about how we approach a thing. So we have the physical stance, which might be like, that's a rock. It has no intention about it. It could be described well by physics. It's a rock. Or we could have a design stance. We could approach something, and the minute we approach it and we notice that it's designed, we immediately have an idea that it should be used in the right way. Yeah, there's a way to use this. Somebody thought about this, they made it in a way. And the final one is the intentional stance. The intentional stance is this idea like when you're playing a computer game, like chess against a computer, you have to imagine that you're playing against somebody, that they have some intention to beat you, yeah? So these three ideas. And the interesting thing I think about that is roughly that then the question becomes, didn't the configuration of the materials I put you in your head, the idea of the horse, the sword, or the lance, and the dragon, didn't that actually give you access to the narrative? So you didn't, like, the narrative didn't just pop into your head. It was the materiality of the situation that enabled you to imagine the story that you were in. So Andy Clark and David Chalmers, I'm sorry I have a lot of big text things, and I apologize for that. Basically say that one of the things to really imagine is that humans are linked with external physical objects, and that if those physical objects, the materiality is removed, they can't cognate the same way. They can't think about the same things without the materials present to them, just as if something were removed from their brain. So Clark is kind of famous for saying there's a way of thinking that your brain is in your skull, And he's saying your brain is, your mind is not contained in your brain. It's contained in the environment that you're in as well. So then we get this weird thing where we can say that all those ideas about narrative, expectation, decisions, are all about representations that have to do with the future. And they have to do with a relationship between what you expect and what you can propose. And in the same way that they degrade, that these representations degrade going into the past, they also degrade or become lower fidelity, or they have increasing possibility into the future. So Barbara Adams says, there's a problem with this. The more complex the interactions knowledge practices unleash, the more likely that their effects will not emerge for very long periods of time. So as we get more complex systems, one of the things that happens is that the cause and effect relations become more distant. And this requires different new ways of thinking about things, or at least noticing what we're thinking about and how we're thinking about them. So we could just basically say expectations, relationships between cause and effect, or explanations of what happened have something to do with an agent doing it, creating something, taking action, a cause, some duration, and an effect. And the question is the effect observable to the agent? And that would be the explanation, how they explain what they observed. So in very short time cycles, it's obvious what happened, and we can use pure empirical methods. Cause, effect, things are very tightly linked together, and therefore explanations become obvious. If I bring a bike in here and the chain is off the sprocket and I ask you how to fix it, you'll say, put the chain back on the sprocket. As things become slightly more distant from each other, we rely on experience, previous experience, our slightly refined, not necessarily concretized models of what we expect to happen in order to cause this effect to happen. This is problematic because experience creates expertise, and you only have so much time to create experience in your life, so there's a limit to the amount of expertise you can bring to bear. And finally, when things get quite distant, we have to rely on theory building and model building in order to explain cause and effect. So, different ways of thinking in different time slices. Now, I want to kind of link this together. When you listen to music, do you listen to one note at a time? And just because I put that note in relation to other notes, kind of in a graph system, like a spatiotemporal system, does that help you hear the music? No, it doesn't. Music has to do with the way in which a previous note colors the current note, and the expectation of what the next note is also colors the current note. Does that make sense? You're spread out over time. You're like smeared over time. Another thing to point out is that if you wanted to capture the dynamics between this note and that note, let's say we came up with some sort of new language, we could put as many new notes in between, and still there would always be a gap. There's always something missing. So this, in phenomenology, is what's called retention and protension. And one of the important things to note about it really quickly is retention and protension are not conscious things. You don't think, oh, I just heard a C, and therefore these are things that might happen next. They are experiential, and they are part of that thinking of being present to something. It's the way in which a song feels like a moment instead of a bunch of slices, yeah? So, there's this other interesting thing that happens when we start thinking about these protensions and retentions. There's two gods of time, Chronos and Kairos. Chronos is the god of sequence. Yeah, harvests come every year. You can plan on them. Things happen in cycles. And Kairos is the god of opportunity. And it is the play between these two gods, it's the play between regularity and surprise that actually makes something enjoyable. So human experiences, joy and meaning, emerge from the interactions between what I expect and the surprise of novel results. All right. So let's talk about, really quickly, what does design do? So if we were going to cook, we have different ways of cooking. One of the ways that we could cook is we could cook on a fire. Now, if we cooked on a fire, we would have an intimate or more intimate relationship with the woods and the fire itself. We'd get all smoky. We would have to figure out exactly how to start the fire. We'd have less control over the fire, the temperature. We would be very present to all of the resources required to create that meal. Design does this. Design takes the fire and turns it into a knob. Very controlled, easy to understand. And it's this simplification that's quite interesting. Because by curtailing potential variation, we actually don't reduce the amount of things we can do with a system, we increase it. And so there's a relationship between these things that causes some interesting effects. And one of the effects is this: supersystems, subsystems, so the stove, matter to supersystems, humans, and peer systems, the stove and the fridge and things like this. And in this mattering, they become materialized. In this materialization, they disclose what matters to the supersystem while enclosing or concealing that which remains. We hide away the access to the resources in the stove so that you have a very simple interaction that makes it easier to understand and control the system. So that works great until this. So everybody who doesn't know Heidegger's hammer, Heidegger was a Nazi, fuck Nazis. Now we'll go on. Heidegger says that a thing in use, swinging the hammer, goes away. It's concealed in that way that I described to you until the moment that it doesn't do what we expect. It breaks, and then it becomes present to us. It comes forward to us. Yeah. Another example of this is Norman doors. If anybody doesn't know what a Norman door is, the problem with this door is that it has what's called an affordance. I hate Norman's description of affordances, but it's a really interesting example. Anyway, both handles are the same. You push or pull which side? So the problem with this is cognitively, the material system is telling you to do something, but it's lying to you. Because when you grab it and try to pull on it, it's a push door, or the opposite, yeah? So it's in this way that design comes to matter. It comes to you, it becomes present to you when things don't work. So another kind of example of this would be what we call service design. I think Starbucks is a really good example of this. If you go into Starbucks and say, give me coffee, you aren't having the Starbucks experience. Yeah? You get coffee, but you're not having the Starbucks experience because Starbucks was very clever in changing the interaction, the expectations that you had with a barista. They changed the language and some of the materiality of the system in order to make it so that once you became entrained to that performance, your expectations of that performance, you couldn't get it anywhere else. So there's this way in which when you walk up to the barista, she has a role to play and you have a role to play. You are contributing to the interaction, and if you play your role well and they play their role well, you get a particular experience. And this is roughly what we call joint activity. I don't like that Klein has no materiality in here, which makes me pissy, but it's this interpredictability that I'm pointing at, yeah? It's the way in which when you are working with someone else, you expect them, like you expect the hammer or you expect the door, to do a certain thing. And if that thing is done, then your expectations are closed and things flow, yeah? So in a way, there's this idea that this expectation has something to do with understanding that there's what's possible, and then within what's possible is what's plausible. So we can't conceive of everything that's possible. We can only kind of conceive what's plausible. And then there's this idea of what's probable. What's our expectation of what will happen, and preferable. And so we sometimes want to move from what we expect to happen to what we want to happen. And this negotiation is how design does its thing. So we have these two ways of thinking. We have representationalism, in your mind, introspective, and it's disentangled. It's not in the moment. And then we have an enacted present, which is enabled, embodied, and entangled. And there's an interaction that's quite interesting between these two ways of thinking. Akoff has this lovely kind of idea of a mess, right? And one of the things he says is the more you can know about the mess, the more you can be fully present to what's happening in your system, the better more likely you are to be able, right? So this is the idea of being present, fully present, yes? And then Herbert Simon points out that that's not actually possible because of time. You can't actually be fully present because you can't fit all of reality in your mind, so you have to make selections. You have to make a model out of the world, and this model is a simplified construction. So representations allow the finite human to grasp the meaning of reality. So it's the interaction between these two, yes, that we want to be fully present and that we want to, that we have to use representations. The interaction between these two causes feedback loops. So there's problems with both of these ways of thinking too. Representationalism uses a very specific theory of truth, and it's called the correspondence theory of truth. There's other ones you could use, but this is the primary one. And it's the idea that if I think something and I compare my model to what actually happens, the closer my prediction is to what actually happens, the more it corresponds to reality. And so this is the idea that the map is not the territory. I know that I can't fully capture reality with my model, but I can tune my model to capture as much predictive power as possible. The other one is really weird too. It's the coherence theory of truth. And this has a lot to do with these way in which the relationship between representational models work. So one of the really difficult things about this is to imagine that when I tell you something, in your representational mind, you're trying to fit the models that you currently have into the models that I'm trying to suggest. And it's making you work and think hard, hopefully, and that's difficult. And part of the problem with that is what we call hyperreality. And hyperreality is the idea that the way that these models interact become bigger than reality itself. We spend more effort keeping the mental models aligned with each other than we do actually comparing them to reality. I call this idea delaminating, when the mental models become more important than the actual thing that's happening. Anyone who's ever had a Gantt chart applied to their work will have general ideas of what I'm talking about. There's this idea, though, that there's a way in which these relate, and the way they relate is what we call praxis. My company's Praxis Flow, and the idea is that theory, or representational knowledge, becomes meaningful only in practice. Meaningful action is the application of theory to a context, to a present, via enacted expectations in the form of modified behavior. When a theory is meaningful, it changes what you will do. And it's a loop because practice actually enriches and changes theory itself. So there's a nice little loop going on there. Next piece, ongoingness. So I've talked about kind of like ways things are either ongoing a little bit or still, but I really want to play with ongoingness a little bit more. And I want to point to this idea from Woods. In an adaptive universe, resources are always finite and change is continuous. So the interesting thing is that, like, if you took off the change and there was just resources, there's a theory in which you could completely capture all the knowledge about the relationship between the resources, and therefore you could have complete knowledge of the world. But because change continues, we get this other thing. And this other thing is that descriptions, explanations of reality, are inexhaustible. You can always continuously redescribe what you are experiencing. That means that multiple points of view, multiple mindsets, multiple representations are often equivalent at some level. So, Feynman tries to talk through this a little bit, and Feynman says that this idea of asking why is actually far more difficult than most people would expect. Because when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? You can give a simple answer that will satisfy people, and that's one of the important aspects of explanation, is to close the question, yes? But there's this other piece which says, when you explain why, you have to be in some framework. That's the representational models that we've been talking about, that allow something to be true, that allow something to be still. Otherwise, you end up perpetually asking why. So if we stay in this presenting thing that I keep on pointing at, we end up just in a loop of why. So I like to think of this kind of interplay between these two modes of thinking like walking. There's two different situations in walking. There's stability, and then there's instability, falling through, yes? And so it's the relationship between letting something be stable, your representational model, and then falling through uncertainty and restabilizing on the other side that causes us to move forward in our thinking and in our world. Just as context allows meaning to be expressed, constraints on behavior make meaningful action possible. Without some form of stability, we can't explain ourselves. So, there's another problem here. And the problem is, how do we select those models? And Simon describes it as a synthetic or artificial object. This is what you might call a designed object. And the decision is how they ought to be in order to attain goals. So, Mr. Hume would like to have a moment on the floor, and his rough answer is, you can't get from an is to an ought. So we can't get from factual statements, or what we would call factual statements, about the world, to moral or ethical statements about the world, oughts. These oughts are decisions that we make without recourse to, for instance, mathematics, science, facts. Oughts are decisions we made because we couldn't use those other things. So, the pure volume of information available to individuals is overwhelming. We have to decide what is important to pay attention to and what is meaningless noise. When we gather together in groups, we explain what we pay attention to in order to share context and therefore meaning. Design has this way of doing ongoingness as well. This is what I would call traditional design. I have a problem, I need a proposal. Okay, let's understand the user context, let's understand the user need, let's do some design. This is the solution. And I think that a lot of what resilience engineering is doing is pointing to this other kind of design. It points to a kind of design that says this with confidence, but with a question, an openness to it, a way in which it's open to new information and it's always reevaluated in context. This whole is other than the sum of its parts. Yes? And the interesting part of that is that if we assume this thing that I'm talking about, this modifies user context, which modulates user needs, which loops back on the this. The more successful we are in thising things and designing things, the more things change. And therefore, design is open-ended and doesn't stop. So, what is present is that which is indeterminate. What's present to us is that which we question or want to understand. So, another rant quickly, hopefully. This is supposed to be a talk about organizational design on some level. So what is this thing that we talk about, self-organization, or particularly, what even is this word? Like, what is organization? Organization and organs are the way in which these kind of parts add up to a whole. Another way of talking about it is mereology, but it's the way that there are parts or that we can identify parts, yeah? So organization can be called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming different or other than. And so individuation can be thought of as the process of ongoing self-organization. So I liked this thing that I found in Decker because he wanted to talk about self-organization. He talked about this idea of reciprocal self-organization. There's a set of patterns, and then there's reciprocal self-organization. And this I'd like to rename as transindividuation, reciprocal self-organization, or becoming individuals together. So, this is a common thought in different ways. I am part of their story, they're part of mine. My narrative is, of my life is a narrative interlocking other narratives, so my stories are actually your stories, and they interrelate. Or Ubuntu, I am because we are. So, this narrative concept allows us to justify what we do by performing for others what they expect us to do, but also constraining what we can do. So, these ideas are all wrapped up in something I call agency, which is the ability to choose to take action, but also the ability to observe the results in the system that we act with. So, I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to give you the wrap-up stuff. Challenges to resilience engineering. Problems of future knowledge. Problems of future knowledge, there are 4 that I have enumerated in my readings, but the most important one, I think, one that you guys probably know about, but you have to deal with, is that what we need to know in the future, we cannot know now. If we could know it now, then it would be current knowledge, not future knowledge. The other way of saying that is what we will know in the future would be nonsensical in the present. It's actually not possible to know about the future. The second kind of version of the problem of the future is that the belief that we actually know the future removes agency from the present, because it actually means that we're just flowing into a predefined state. There's also the problem of expertise, or what's called post-normality, or science is fake news. This is the devaluation of expertise, primarily because it's very difficult to measure expertise. In the literature, philosophy literature, expertise is often examined through the idea of a jury. And you can imagine if you're on a jury and one person's saying, I was there and Bill shot Bob, and the other person says, no, I was there and Bill didn't shoot Bob. Those are experiences, they're experts, they have expertise you don't have, you weren't there. How do you judge the difference between these two things? That is a problem of expertise. Anthrocomplexity. One of the interesting things yesterday we talked about was kind of bone formation and all these things, which I love as examples of resilience, but all of those are what I would call normal complexity. Because inside the bone, the osteoblasts and osteoclasts and osteocytes aren't negotiating the rules of their interaction. Humans can renegotiate the boundaries and rules with which they interact. And that adds another layer of complexity on top of what we would consider to be normal complexity. I think this is a problem because the question for me and resilience engineering is, why is that funny? And I think part of why that's funny is that there's an idea that resilience engineering is kind of entwined in skillful coping. And the very fact that we can skillfully cope with things means that there's a negative impact on the likelihood the system will change. So we can't get rid of skillful coping because then we would be getting rid of resilience. But if we over-rely on skillful coping, we get melty face there. There's also this idea that when we work with technology, the needs that we are providing for, are often the needs of the technology itself and not of humans. So how do we deal with that? How do we not lose agency? How do we not become controlled by the very technology that we are trying to build? We have to keep on saying fuck the Nazis, and then be aware that technology is not a thing, it is a thing we do. And it's the doing of that thing that makes it non-objective. Now, it's important to note that Heidegger is not saying that technology is wrong or false. He's not an anti-technologist. He's simply saying that technology only reveals one form of truth, and that there are other forms of truth. The other one is this weird one. We have to deal with this idea of entangled intentions. Over there, we have this idea that there's like chain-like events. All what is relationships, all kind of mathematically validatable or scientifically, factually validatable things. But in fact, many, many things that we have built in the world are artificial, and the designed artificial things have these oughts that I described in them. And the oughting means that when you ask, why is it like that? The answer is because Jabe thought it was a good idea for it to be like that. And that's the end of the explanation. There isn't anything under there. And therefore it loops around on itself in a way that is unresolvable. This means that we end up with contingent contingencies. We're not just contingent on natural laws, we're contingent on those oughts. And the world as artificial consists of an array of configurations which are more or less persistent propositions. So some suggestions from here, if I can get through them quickly enough. First of all, pay a lot of attention to this idea. There's retrospective coherence. This community is incredibly overly aware of this, yes? How do I make sense of the actions that I've taken in the world? And then there's sense-making. This is in the incident. How do I make sense of what is happening? I think the thing that would be useful to think about with resilience engineering is this idea of prospective coherence. And the idea of prospective coherence in resilience engineering would simply be the idea that when you make a change, you would think, what expectations do people have of the system that I am changing? What will they have to make sense of in the world if I put this thing in the world? Be clear about the idea that observations underdetermine explanations, both in the past and in the future, and that these are different ways of thinking. Yes, all the stuff in the future is about what's possible, probable, all these things, but the things in the past are actually what are perceivable, what was perceived, and how structured the perception and what was perceivable. What the materiality of the situation structured what you could see. In that same frame, understand that the artificial synthetic world is materially constructed and it's reproduced. That construction is reproduced. It's not produced once. It's reproduced to make meaning possible for humans. And that design is a way of ensuring agency in the face of complexity and uncertainty. We also need to be careful of moving away from some of these normal ways of thinking about how people work, either homo sociologicus, someone who thinks that everything comes from history and context, and therefore is overdetermined by their environment, or that we have this idea of modeling, Homo economicus being the most extreme one, where we're overdetermined by our models. In both of these things, we're removing agency from humans. We're removing the ability to make decisions and therefore allowing for skillful coping. And we want to move towards this idea of understanding what is made present, how the environment makes things present, how we have temporally extended intentions through that present, and how that opens questions and enables embedded action. We need to understand that transformation requires the ongoing ability to identify, establish, maintain, modify, and remove boundaries. That's the whole individuation part that I was talking about. In relation to this ability, transition is the process by which boundaries in organizations, their decision criteria, roles, and technical implications are discovered and made sense of. These boundaries are different from different perspectives, and the negotiations of those boundaries, I think, are what cause a transformation to happen. And it's the fact that you have to do that negotiation for the transformation to occur that means that it's a temporally extended thing, and therefore it is a transition and not a transformation. Don't have an end state in your head when you start. We need this idea that our worldview, the whole that we have, selects and refines attention and intention of our experience of the world, and the interpretation of that experience modifies the worldview. This is called a hermeneutic loop. And in that hermeneutic loop, there's an idea of horizons, and this is another way of describing boundaries, and it's important for us to note those horizons because that is what allows us to actually look up. The little skateboard idea here is my son was on a kick scooter, and he was ripping down the street looking at his feet, and he ran right into a pay meter. And he got up and looked at me and said, "Dad, this is really hard. You have to look at your feet and where you're going at the same time." There's also these three different ways of working that I want to really quickly point at. Collaboration, using empirical methods to examine the emergent nowness, working together on individuation that causes divergence. Cooperation, extending intentions in the ongoing nowness, being present to what is continuing, working together to maintain expectations via transindividuation as an enabling activity. And coordination, ordinate is a place where we're going to meet, yes, an ordinate. Coordination, extended intentions towards a shared future, working towards working together. How are we going to be better in the future? How are we going to work in the future? Which is a form of transindividuation that is convergent instead of divergent. Notice the difference between this idea of present thinking and some of its advantages, and gap thinking and some of its disadvantages. And I'll point them out really quickly. When you want to define a far future state, your executive will spend huge amounts of political capital to make that future state more desirable than your current state. One of the best ways to do that is to radically devalue your current state. To say that way that you do it right now is kind of shitty, we should do it that way. By devaluing this present, we remove agency and the sense of being able to be skillful at work in order to say that there's a better way of doing things in the future. The results of this is long-term planning and execution with long feedback cycles that are non-interactive and often a sunk cost fallacy that refuses to allow us to re-examine that end state. I hate this dichotomy that is prevalent in our industry. The problem-solution frame is both that you can define a problem clearly, and when you define the problem clearly, a solution will emerge. I think that this is closing and not opening. It refuses the ongoingness that I want you guys to understand about design. Instead, what we need is to open questions to each other, make those questions meaningful to the people who are doing the work so that they can make propositions that are evaluated in context continuously. This is a little bit of like a DevSecOps thing, but I also I love socio-technical systems as a theory, but it's really important, I think, that we rethink it a little bit in that it's not socio-technical, it's socio-techni-ecological, in that techni is an activity. Technology is something we do. And in doing, we are skillfully coping with the negotiation between an ecology, set of things out of our control, materiality, etc., and our social expectations. Note the difference between hierarchy and heterarchy. Hierarchy is the way in which a system is organized out of context. Functional silos being an example. Heterarchy is the dynamic reassembly of hierarchies based on context. Boundary spanning roles, important. If we have these boundaries that we're talking about, that are the way in which we individuate, having someone help the others negotiate those boundaries with each other, not for them, is an important role. And if you are taking these ideas seriously, you will have someone whose responsibility is to negotiate those boundaries with others. Finally, some specific advice for this community. There's a difference between negative space and attractors. I've heard way too much at this conference about what we aren't. We're not DevOps, we're not this, we're not that, we're not chaos engineering, etc. I think this community will be much more successful if it sets itself out to be an attractor of interesting conversations that talk about how we become together with others. And finally, it's not too late to resist what is happening on the planet. We have an entire world that needs resilience. Get busy already. Thank you.